The United Nations classifies more than 15 days in solitary confinement as torture. Not uncomfortable, not damaging. Torture, in the same category as deliberate physical abuse. And the reason isn't political, it's neurological. This is what happens to a perfectly healthy human mind inside that room, and why the damage doesn't stop when the door finally opens. The typical solitary confinement cell measures 6 feet by 9 feet, smaller than most parking spaces. Inside, a concrete slab, a mattress, a metal toilet, a sink. A door with a slot for food 3 times a day. Sometimes a narrow window that provides light but no meaningful view. Sometimes no window at all. The occupant spends between 22 and 24 hours of every day in this space. Any remaining time is spent alone in a slightly larger concrete enclosure. No other inmates, no meaningful human contact, no purposeful activity. Just the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and whatever the mind generates to fill the silence. The first week is not quiet. The brain, wired by millions of years of evolution to constantly process an environment, is suddenly given almost nothing to process. Rather than relaxing, it amplifies. Every sound becomes significant. A distant door, ventilation hum, footsteps that might be approaching. The threat detection system never turns off because it has nothing to confirm you are safe, so it assumes you aren't. Sleep fractures, not from noise, from a nervous system that cannot downregulate. Intrusive thoughts arrive, repetitive, circular, impossible to redirect. The mind has no external material to work with. It begins feeding on itself. By the end of the first week, documented in study after study, the majority of isolated inmates show measurable increases in anxiety, emotional instability, and what researchers describe as a desperate, escalating hunger for stimulation. For anything, from anywhere, the hallucinations begin earlier than anyone expects. Not after months, not in some extreme case study. In many documented accounts, auditory hallucinations begin within the first 2 weeks of isolation. And this is the detail that separates the reality of solitary confinement from every assumption about it. They are not a symptom of mental illness. They are a symptom of a healthy brain that has been deprived of input. The human brain requires stimulation to function. When external input drops below a functional threshold, the brain doesn't shut down. It generates. It manufactures phantom sounds, voices, and sensations, not because something has malfunctioned, but because it is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is trying to give you a world to process. Because a brain without a world to process begins, inevitably, to process itself. Inmates hear their name being called, conversations in empty corridors, music with no source. Other people, present, audible, and entirely non-existent. What makes this particularly disturbing is the awareness many inmates maintain throughout. They know the sounds aren't real. They hear them anyway. By the end of the first month, the psychological profile of a healthy adult in solitary confinement is clinically indistinguishable from someone in acute psychiatric crisis. Paranoia becomes structural, not occasional suspicious thoughts, a fixed, constant certainty that threat is present, that everything is being watched, that safety does not exist anywhere in the environment. Dissociation develops, the sense of watching yourself from a distance, existing outside your own body, a symptom considered serious in any clinical context, emerging in healthy people from nothing more than weeks of silence. Emotional regulation collapses, uncontrolled crying documented in the majority of long-term isolation cases, spontaneous, without trigger, without the ability to stop, not grief. The emotional regulation system simply losing the structural capacity to function. And then the most disturbing behavioral symptom researchers identify: self-harm as sensation-seeking, not suicidal intent, not even necessarily painful in the conventional sense. Simply feeling something, anything. A nervous system so deprived of input that pain becomes preferable to the continuation of nothing. Since neuroimaging became precise enough to document it, researchers have found something that moved solitary confinement from policy debate to medical fact. The structural changes are visible on a scan. The hippocampus, responsible for memory and spatial navigation, physically shrinks in inmates who have undergone extended isolation. The prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation, shows measurably decreased activity. These are not temporary functional changes that resolve when circumstances improve. They are structural, physical, identical to the changes observed in patients with traumatic brain injury. Harvard psychiatrist Stuart Gracian spent decades documenting what he called SHU syndrome, named for the security housing units where solitary is typically held. His conclusion: isolation produces a unique psychiatric syndrome, not a worsening of existing conditions. A new condition, created entirely by the environment. When an inmate is finally released from solitary, returned to general population, or eventually to the world outside, the assumption is that relief arrives with them. It doesn't. Former solitary inmates describe an inability to tolerate the noise and movement of a normal environment. Sounds that were previously unremarkable become physically overwhelming. The hypersensitivity that developed in silence doesn't reverse when the silence ends. Human faces, the input the brain is most specifically wired to read, the thing it was most deprived of, become sources of confusion and fear rather than recognition and comfort. And here is the most disturbing documented reality of extended solitary confinement. When inmates are released and return to normal conditions, a measurable percentage request to go back. Not because they preferred the cell, because the world they've returned to, its noise, its complexity, its unpredictable human movement, has become genuinely more terrifying than isolation. The cell didn't just change where they were, it changed what they could survive. 30 days. That is all it takes for a healthy human brain, no prior mental illness, no vulnerability, no predisposition, to develop hallucinations, measurable structural damage, and a fear of human contact that can persist for the rest of a person's life. The UN classified this as torture in 2011. Approximately 80,000 people are held in solitary confinement in the United States alone. Right now, today, the cell does not need to hold someone for the cell to hold someone. That is the most accurate thing that can be said about what 30 days in solitary confinement does to the human mind. The prison doesn't end when the door opens. For many people, that is precisely when it begins. The hallucinations don't start after months. They start within 2 weeks. In a healthy brain, with no prior mental illness, does knowing that change how you think about solitary confinement as a legal sentence?